So we're going to look at the U.S. and World War II, and I'm going to give you first kind of an overview of World War II, just bare bones basics, and then we'll look at kind of the U.S.'s relationship with World War II, and then the impacts of World War II on the U.S. So we're looking at the U.S. and World War II. What we're talking about with World War II is a war that starts in 1939 in Europe and ends in 1945. So the war starts with a lot of the same reasons as World War I, but we have in World War II also the growth of fascism in Europe as being an issue as well. But a lot of the same dynamics are there. And World War II is one of those events that has been talked about and represented repeatedly in movies, in books, in documentaries, in retelling, to the point where it's like become like mythologized. And there's a lot of fact about World War II that has kind of been tossed off to the side in favor of a story that serves a purpose, especially when we're talking about the United States, right? A lot of times people refer to like World War II as like the last war was a clear good guys and bad guys, but we have to be wary of that kind of idea of good guys and bad guys, especially with considering who's telling the story and what the agenda is. Okay, so when we're looking at World War II, the United States does not get directly involved in terms of boots on the ground military involvement until December 7th, 1941, when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, and that's when the U.S. officially entered the war. And when the U.S. enters the war, the way that the war gets framed is as though it's like a test of American democracy versus fascism. Right? So it's like, who's going to win, democracy or fascism? And when we're talking about fascism, and it's on the rise in the world right now as well, what we mean by fascism is it's a type of government in which there is a dictatorial leader, right? Somebody who is at the head of the government and who has, to some or to all extent, unchallenged power to make decisions on where the government's going to go, usually using the military to enforce those decisions. And oftentimes what characterizes a fascist government is a great limit on individual rights. But for this, the limiting of individual rights is couched as needed or necessary in order to elevate the nation or the race. Right? So like everyone has to sacrifice their individual rights in order for the nation to grow stronger or to be protected or to dominate or whatever it is. And so you have a severe oppression of any kind of opposition to that government. So when we're talking about fascism versus democracy, to make it a kind of a black or white issue, the reality is okay, if we take the United States as a democracy, we realistically can look at the ways that the United States today and throughout history has not acted democratically, especially to certain segments of the population or towards certain groups. And so to kind of position fascism against American democracy as like two opposing opposite things is misleading. However, when we're talking about fascism during this time period, it is extreme, it is intense. We're talking about a situation where, and somebody summarized this best, a historian saying, you can recognize fascism or a fascist leader because they offer simple solutions for complex problems. So you have these complex problems in a society like economic downturn, fighting between different ethnic or religious groups, unemployment, fighting over resources and land, and so on. These are complex problems with a lot of different factors to consider. But if someone comes along and says, oh, well, just do this, right? Here's a simple solution. that's where you have to be wary, right? Because as we're going to see in World War II, that simple solution usually comes at the great expense of one or more other groups in society. So when we're talking about World War II, the two sides fighting in the war, along the similar lines of the sides in World War I, and with a lot of the same kind of issues prompting them to fight each other as in World War I. So you have the Allies on one side, you have the US, France, it's not Russia anymore, it's the Soviet Union or the USSR, which is communist Russia, China, and the US. And I put France and the USSR in brackets there because during the war, before and during the war, there's a little bit of switching sides for those nations depending on their interaction with Germany. And then you have, so the Allies versus the Axis powers. And the Axis powers are Germany, Italy, and Japan, right? And so Germany, of course, this is the age of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime, right? And so, again, a lot of misunderstanding about this, right? Like, Adolf Hitler was elected into office. He didn't seize power in like some kind of coup d'etat or anything. He was elected. The German people chose him as a leader. Likewise, in Italy, you have Mussolini, both fascist leaders, both kind of uplifted as somehow, in some ways, kind of like almost like a cult leader, right? Like to some kind of supernatural level of being a savior. Remember, Germany was struggling with the economy and the devastation from World War I, and the way that they were excluded from a lot of the plans of rebuilding Europe. And Italy had internal conflicts that eventually led to Mussolini coming to power to drive the nation towards more economic success. Also, economic issues, a major problem. And then Japan had an emperor, and Japan was an imperialist power, and they had conquered and ruled over Korea for a long time, very brutally in many ways, right? And then they invaded other places like Manchuria and threatened China. But remember also, we look at the Allied side, for all the invading that the Axis powers did, remember, we're talking about the UK, France, Russia, the US, all imperialist powers as well, right? And all holding colonies and territories themselves. And that's an important thing to remember as we talk about kind of how the war plays out. So so there are the flags of the Allied powers, and it's a mix of flags, but the US, Britain, China, France, and the Soviet Union, and then the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan. And of course, the German flag is no longer that flag. That's the flag of the German nation under the Nazi regime. That flag of Japan is no longer the flag of Japan anymore, right? That's the flag of Imperial Japan, when Japan was an empire and had an emperor. So the way that some of the causes for World War I are things that happened in for World War II are the things that happened in World War I. Right? As I mentioned, a lot of the debt that Germany was saddled with built up a lot of resentment among the German people about their perceived mistreatment by the winners of World War I. And so then Hitler comes along and takes that resentment and uses it to build his movement, right? To reclaim some lost glory of Germany and reclaim the rightful position of Germany as like the ruler of Europe. And that's going to lead to eventually the Nazis invading various places in Europe to build what they perceive was the correct homeland of the German people, and then also to build an empire. Japan also, building its empire, invaded China. Italy, and this is the thing, is that these nations were fighting for who had the right to invade where. This is a big part of why these nations were fighting each other in Europe. Who has the right to conquer where? Which empire has the right to which colonies? And so Italy, also being kind of left out, or feeling that they were left out of this empire building, wanted to take their place. So we can invade Africa too. So Italy invades Ethiopia, and that is a cause for alarm among the UK, France, right? They're like, Italy can't do that. All the while, Britain and France both have colonies in Africa. They've done the same thing. You know, they've colonized parts of the Middle East and Asia and Australia as well. As the Nazi regime grows, there is kind of like concern about the way that so these European countries are kind of like monitoring Hitler's regime and like, okay, as long as he stays in his lane and he's, following the rules and not threatening any of our empires, then it's okay. But very quickly, Germany steps out of its lane, and Germany invades Poland, right? Okay, so the invasion of Poland itself is seen as outrageous. And there are, anti-colonialist and decolonialist historians who write about this, looking at it from a decolonial perspective. Why was it outrageous for Germany to invade Poland and unacceptable when all these different European empires were invading places all over the place to conquer them? Well, a very famous quote from a colonialist or decolonialist historian, Amy Césaire, he says, the biggest crime that Hitler committed in the eyes of these European empires was that he was doing to now a European nation what European nations had done to other countries around the world or other people around the world, right? So that's the unacceptable part. Because Germany invades Poland, which is another European nation, Britain and France declare war on Germany. And then, on top of that, Germany goes back on its word, which again we've seen the United States do and other nations do when they say, oh yeah, we will help you with this or that, or we will give you your land or whatever. But the crime is that they go back on their word on a European nation, right? So in 1941, Germany invaded Russia. And this is why Russia was in brackets too. Originally, the USSR, Russia, was allied with Germany, and they made a pact in 1939 that they're going to have each other's backs. Once Germany invaded Poland and began to move eastward, expanding its realm of control, they decided to invade Russia. And Russia was like, hey, we were supposed to be friends. And Germany was like, psych. And so that war breaks out there. Okay. All of this is going on in Europe, and it's mainly Europe, right, that this is happening. Japan's kind of doing its thing in terms of like trying to dominate in Asia. But this is all kind of this argument over who gets what in Europe, what is okay to do and what is not okay among these different European empires and nations. Across the pond, across the Atlantic Ocean, is the U.S. And the U.S. is like scraping its way out of the 1930s, out of the Great Depression, right? It's trying to get on track with the New Deals and trying to rebuild and everything. So a lot of the U.S. public was like, we don't care what's happening in Europe. We don't care what's happening in the world. We already learned from World War I. If we get involved in world affairs, it leads to a lot of sorrow and tragedy for the American people, and it only is beneficial really to industrialists, right? So there was a big push for isolationism, right? Like to isolate the U.S. and be like, let's just mind our own business. Let's stay neutral. And, like I said, that was a response to what people saw as like kind of like immoral, unethical, uncouth profiteering off of the suffering of World War I by industry. You have people struggling still through the Great Depression. And then you have the Good Neighbor policy and the Monroe Doctrine, right? Set by like Roosevelt and President Monroe back in the day of like the idea that the world is kind of divided into two realms. The Western Hemisphere, which is North and South America, is the realm of the United States control. That's our business, where we get involved in Latin America and orchestrate stuff there. And Europe leaves us alone to do that, right? And then the other half of the world, the Eastern Hemisphere, there's kind of this agreement that Europe is in control of the Eastern Hemisphere. That's Europe, Africa, Asia, Australia, right? And that's why the U.S. kind of stayed out of Europe's, domination and conquest of so many colonies in that half of the world. So people are like, look, that's their business. Let's stay out of it. But the U.S. is allied with Britain. Britain is not the U.S.'s number one ally, right? The U.S. is also allied with France, right? And so France and Britain are like, hey, we're in this war, help us. So the U.S. is again pushed like to help in some way, to break its neutrality. So, but there's a push in the American public saying, no, we're struggling through the Great Depression. So Congress passes a couple of laws that are neutrality laws, right? Originally saying in 1935, we're not going to sell weapons. Congress passed a law, no weapons selling to any belligerents. Belligerents are the nations involved in a war. To any side, neither side, friends or foe, it doesn't matter, we're not going to sell weapons. We're also not going to make loans for them so they can buy weapons, okay, from other countries. We're not going to do that. We're going to stay out of it. That's true neutrality. But the heat and the pressure is on the U.S. as especially Britain sees that this thing is growing with the Nazi Party, and there's, kind of a fear that it's going to break out in some kind of conflict. So Congress goes back on those neutrality laws, and in 1937 says, well, you know what, we won't sell weapons or military goods. We'll sell non-military goods only to whoever as cash and carry, meaning you have to have the cash on hand. We're not going to make loans. We're not going to give credit. That's it, right? So we're just going to, that's for us to build our economy. We're going to keep selling goods. But as the war finally begins in Europe in 1939, the U.S. takes even further steps backwards and says, actually, we're going to sell just the UK and France military supplies, but only cash and carry. We're not going to give you any credit. It's just business. But again, it's no longer neutrality because they're choosing specific countries to sell military supplies to. And then the U.S., even before it enters the war, goes kind of all in here. In 1941, at the beginning of the year, they passed the Lend-Lease Act to loan and lease weapons to allies. So it's no longer cash and carry. They're going to loan on credit and lease weapons, right? So not just, non-military goods, not just military supplies, but weapons now, only to the allied powers. So it's very clear here. Now, some people say, okay, well, it's maybe because they saw what was happening to people under the Nazis, right? Maybe they knew that there was the things that would eventually lead to the Holocaust, and they saw this is unacceptable and Hitler's a maniac and da-da-da. Okay, the Nazi Party, a big part of their platform was to kind of secure the Rhineland, the homeland for the master race, right? Which they felt was like this Aryan race of Germanic people, and to exclude and get rid of those that were a threat to that, which is always kind of a nationalistic thing, as we saw in World War I with the Armenian genocide, or the genocide in the Ottoman Empire. So you begin to have, similar to what happened in the Armenian genocide, and what Nazi leaders kind of studied from what the United States did in terms of U.S. Indian policy, and using U.S. scientists or pseudoscientists' eugenics studies, built kind of this policy on how to deal with kind of what the unwanted people in society, the misfits. And so you saw growing policies of oppression initially, right, of like curfews and segregation and kind of limits on access to education or medical care against not only Jewish people, but Polish people when they invaded Poland, anyone who put up any kind of resistance, anyone that was deemed a threat to society. So you had people that were deemed quote-unquote homosexuals, people who were disabled, people who were communists, people who were different religions, right, or kind of all targeted as not being the ideal people for this new nation, right? So severe violence begins to erupt towards these specific groups of people at the hands of the Nazi government. Just like in the Armenian genocide, the U.S. government knows this is happening. This is not the reason they enter the war. This is not the reason they start to support the Allies. And we know that because in the United States you had severe anti-Semitism. there was a severe anti-Jewish sentiment in the United States, to the point where you have most of the Jewish refugees who are fleeing from the violence and oppression from the hands of the Nazis being denied asylum in the U.S. So it's not like, that this is like, oh, this is such appalling treatment, let's change our policies so we can admit these folks, right? No, because the United States, again, these refugees don't fit the vision of what the United States wanted for their population per their own immigration laws. Remember the quota system and barring people in order to tailor the population to what the vision of real Americans should be, right? I believe Anne Frank, if you've read the diary of Anne Frank, her family was also denied asylum in the United States as well. So it really came down to supporting their allies, the U.S.'s allies, against a growing threat of the Nazi government taking over and threatening other European empires. And so as the United States begins to assist just the Allied powers, there's a realization that, okay, this might be a thing that we're going to get drawn into. And so the U.S. begins preparing for war. And they needed to, because the U.S. military had severely downgraded itself after World War I, in hopes of kind of like, never again, we're going to get into a great war like this. And, and after all the criticism also about the involvement in World War I. So at the beginning of World War II, the U.S. only had 175,000 troops, whereas Germany had 5 million. And so realizing, okay, so if we do get pulled into this war, we're not prepared. And so there starts to be this push to, we at least need to upgrade our military to be prepared. So President Roosevelt tries to convince Congress to intervene, right? Making the claim that Hitler and Mussolini are madmen who respect force and force alone, that we have to do something to help quarantine the aggressors, like to limit how much impact they can have. And yes, they are at this point kind of cutting a swath of like destruction and chaos and violence across Europe, right? But again, it's of supreme importance because it's happening in Europe to Europeans, whereas at the same time you have equal, if not worse, policies of violence in African colonies, in Middle Eastern colonies, in Asian colonies, in Australia. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Okay, but this is a real threat to these nations of Europe. And so in 1940, FDR calls for an increase in military spending, and then beyond just regular military spending, the U.S. then pivots towards developing a new weapon. During this time period, Albert Einstein, who had to flee from Europe, right, and who had traveled the world, world-renowned, scientist, right, he came to the United States and let President Roosevelt know, look, you don't have any clue that Germany is working on a secret project right now, and they're attempting to build a weapon like we've never seen before. And what he was talking about was nuclear weapons, right? And so Einstein implores Roosevelt, look, if Germany is the only country that's going to have these nuclear weapons, it's going to be horrific for the rest of the world, right? So the United States is going to put a bunch of resources into trying to develop the nuclear weapon first, or at least to also have a nuclear weapon to kind of neutralize the threat from Germany. And so a top secret project is created called the Manhattan Project, where the United States takes this warning from Einstein and begins to work on developing a nuclear bomb. Okay, so you have an increase in military spending, the creation of this Manhattan Project, all before the United States is even officially in the war. How does the United States get into the war? Well, we have its relationship with Japan. So this is all happening in Europe, and Japan is doing its own thing in Asia, expanding into a variety of territories. And because of that, the U.S. decided to send a message to Japan to stop trying to invade all of these Asian nations. So they froze Japan's assets and cut off all oil supplies to Japan. Okay, because of that, Japan is like, oh, okay, so it's clear you're not on my side, you're not on our side, so we're going to sign with the other side. Japan signs with Germany and Italy and the Axis powers, and then moves forward with brutally invading China, Manchuria, and Southeast Asia. Right, and so China, some of the parts of China are places that the British, have colonies, have business investments. Southeast Asia was colonized by France. And so now by Japan invading those places, now they are directly threatening British and French colonial interests, right? And then that's the U.S. is allies. So in summer of 1941, the Atlantic Charter is signed by the U.S. and 11 anti-Axis nations to try and stop Nazi tyranny. And naval war begins in the Atlantic Ocean to try and block German ships, to send a message of unity against the Axis powers. The U.S. then continues to kind of freeze out Japan, and Japan continues to kind of send, threats towards the United States of like, you need to sell us oil. They were in desperate need of oil, right, as they're fighting this war. So Japan sends a warning to the U.S. Look, you need to end our oil embargo. If you're not involved in this war, this is not okay for you to do. If you want to get involved in the war, we're going to get you involved, right? And so Japan makes a push to get the U.S. in the war fully by bombing the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor. Sorry for the typo there. Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. With that, right now, Pearl Harbor is in Hawaii. Hawaii is a territory of the United States. It's a naval base that they bombed, right? With that, people are outraged, right? Like an attack on U.S. soil, right? This territory of Hawaii. And so now many people who are like, no, let's just stay out of it, we're like, no, we got to fight back. And so the U.S. declares war on Japan, and then with that, of course, Germany and Italy. And so the U.S. now moves full force forward to build its war industry back to what it had been during wartime. In 1942, the War Production Board converted all industry that was making consumer goods towards war production. Remember, the United States has this huge industrial kind of complex here in the United States that was shrinking because of the Great Depression. Now this war has boosted it back up, right? And it reinvigorated it. And so by the end of 1942, the U.S. now outproduced Germany, Italy, and Japan combined, just the U.S. alone, right? And by the end of the war, the U.S. makes out on top of everybody, producing half of the world's goods. So the U.S. greatly benefits from World War II, and then will emerge as a major economic, military, and political powerhouse afterwards. In attempt to kind of get the public involved and supporting the war, there was a lot of propaganda, right? Propaganda posters, again, putting artists to work to kind of create this sense of like unity. We have to work together. To workers and wives and everyone in society has to work together with soldiers to win this war. And so workers were taxed, but it was couched in terms of being patriotic and supporting the troops. Government bonds, war bonds were sold to finance the war. And then unemployment dropped. And so kind of society turns around, and like the war, as tragic as it is, it's also, again, invigorating and putting people back to work. You have a large portion of the population being sent off to war, which leads to more employment. War production grows, which leads to more employment. All right, that brings us to the first part of our writing assignment number 10 for this week. You're going to read a PDF that's there on Canvas, the words of President Roosevelt, FDR, and you're going to answer these two questions. Describe in your own words what President Roosevelt says are the basic foundations of democracy. Describe the improvement that he suggests and his hopes for the world. And then we look at kind of what's happening on the United States home front, and then especially with gender first, as we look at the growth of the war industry. So the sacrifices that people had to make in terms of paying higher taxes and buying war bonds and then dealing with shortages, and then having to ration how much you use of everything, all of it was reframed as patriotic, right? You can't use as much fabric as you used to anymore because they are needed for uniforms, and you can't, consume as much tin or food or whatever, use as much of that because it's needed for the war effort. And so kind of created this unifying effect of kind of patriotism. It also pulled women into the effort, right? From doing things at home, like growing what were called victory gardens, right? Growing your own vegetables so that it frees up food to feed the troops. Women also enlisted, even though women could not enlist in the military as soldiers. The government created the Women's Army Corps of kind of like auxiliary forces of women enlisting and doing like secretarial work, nursing, and so on. And then you also have women being encouraged to join the workforce. About 8 million women joined the workforce. And they were definitely needed as workers, but that was a major change from kind of, peacetime expectations of women, right? And there was a lot of concern expressed by men in the military, men in the government, that, okay, well, if women start going to work, who's going to be the homemakers, right? What happens when the men come back from the war? Are these women going to replace them in the workplace? If women are working in these industrial jobs, doesn't that feminize the work? And then that's going to make men like women, and there's always this concern about anything masculine being woman-like, because misogyny, right, is like this fear that like womanly things are lower in value and going to bring everyone down, right? But the army like published pamphlets to like soothe the fears of soldiers, like pros and cons of having your wife work, and again, these propaganda posters and movie reels or news reels during when people went to go see the movies kind of were used to kind of create this image that this is a patriotic thing, and it's a temporary thing, right? And so you have like Rosie the Riveter, and like images of kind of women working in factories or in Army Corps positions, being put in kind of newspaper articles and magazines and showcased in newsreels as a positive thing, right? And so you have this poster here, "Good work, sister," right? America's women have met the test. So kind of creating this like amicable relationship where it's non-threatening women helping the war effort. All right, so you are going to read about this a little bit more in the textbook in the section called Rosie the Riveter, and you're going to answer this question. Describe according to the reading how the types of work women, describe according to the reading the types of work women did. One more time. How the types of work women did change during World War II. Okay, so you're going to be looking at the changes in the type of work women did, and then also how did a lot of that work stay the same, but using the reading as a reference.